بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. أما بعد. Alhamdulillah, we continue our Saturday morning session covering Mataratul Qulub, the text on the purification of the hearts. And we're not going to be able to finish the text before Ramadan. So after Ramadan, we still have a few more sessions, maybe five or so sessions after Ramadan. But we carry on, inshallah. So in the last two sessions, we were speaking about the disease of Riyah. And today, inshallah, we're going to talk about the next disease of the heart, its cause and cure. And this disease is known as relying upon other than Allah. So it is the violation of tawakkul, where tawakkul is not placed with Allah Ta'ala, rather it is in other things. So we begin with the words of Imam Muhammad Mawlud al-Yaqubi in his text, where he says, rahimahullah, ورهبوت غير ربي والرغب ضد التوكل عليه وسبب الأمرين استعاد بالمتين من كل داء قلة اليقين. So he starts off by saying that fear of and desire for other than my Lord contradicts absolute trust in Him. The origin of both of them, and I seek refuge in the mighty from every disease, is lack of certainty. So what we see here is what we're describing as not relying upon other than Allah Ta'ala. He is defining as fear of other than Allah or desire for other than Allah. So he'll explain what this means further on. So basically, it is placing one's raghba and rahba in other than Allah. He uses these two terms. What is raghba? Raghba is like longing or yearning or desiring. And rahba is fear. Fear. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the prophets in the Quran by saying, وَيَدَعُونَنَا رَغَبًا وَرَهَبًا وَكَانُوا لَنَا خَاشِعِينَ. They invoked and worshipped me raghaban wa rahaba, out of longing and yearning, as well as the reverential fear. وَكَانُوا لَنَا خَاشِعِينَ. And they were humbly submitted to us. So he's saying that placing your raghba, this longing desire, in other than Allah, or placing this rahba, this fear, in other than Allah, contradicts the virtue of tawakkul, which is considered a disease of the heart. So in order to frame this discussion, we have to talk about tawakkul. What is tawakkul? Tawakkul is trust in Allah or reliance in Allah. This is the literal translation, but how are we defining it? You see, this book is different from a lot of the books or a lot of the exposure people have to matters of the heart. Because here he gives us a very fiqhi structure by mentioning the terms, defining the terms, explaining the conditions and the causes and the cures. It's very methodical. So what exactly is tawakkul and how is it defined? Here's a question for all of you. This is more for tulab ilm, but it's an important question. So you recognize the names when you hear them. Let's suppose you come across a term in Sharia and you want to know what is the definition of that term. The definition, the ta'arif or the had, is what describes the essence of that thing. So it has to be jami'un mani'. It has to be inclusive of everything that makes it what it is, and exclusive, excluding what is not from it. So say you come across a term like tawakkul and you want to find out what is the definition of tawakkul. Where would you go? There are many works by the ulama wherein they define terms. But the most famous book that describes the definitions of things, and it's like a dictionary of definitions, is the famous work called At-Ta'rifat, which is literally, the title is Definitions, by Sayyid al-Sharif al-Jurjani, rahimahullah ta'ala. Usually we start there, and then we go further in looking at the definitions of things. So what is the definition of tawakkul according to Sayyid al-Sharif al-Imam al-Jurjani? He says in his definitions that tawakkul is الثقة بما في يد الله واليأس مما في أيدي الناس. He says that it is having confidence in what is with Allah while despairing from what is in the hands of other people. So you see that it combines two realities. One is this feeling of confidence with what is with Allah. What is with Allah? Everything. وَالْيَأْسُ مِمَّا فِي أَيْدِ النَّاسِ, and despairing of what is in the hands of others. Meaning, when he says yats, it means it's not even something where you have a sliver of hope. No, you don't even bother. That's how he defines tawakkul. That's not the only definition, though. Other scholars say that tawakkul is using the asbab, using the secondary causes, the means, while witnessing, in using the means, that Allah is the true doer. So what the second definition tells us is that there is no contradiction between using the asbab, the secondary causes, and putting trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The early Imams would say, Imam al-Junayd said this, he said that violating tawakkul or not having tawakkul is a violation of tawheed, while neglecting the asbab, the secondary causes, is a violation of the sunnah. And as believers, you have to see with two eyes. And I mean that metaphorically. We have to see with two eyes. Who only sees with one eye? Who is a'war? Who is only one-eyed? The Dajjal. Dajjal doesn't mean he's a cyclops, by the way. A'war doesn't mean cyclops with one eye. It means he has two eyes, but he's blind in one eye. That's literal. That's literal. However, there's also this deeper meaning, which is it's either all inward or all outward, right? The believer sees things inward with the inward reality and the outward reality. So inwardly is who is the creator and controller of everything, Allah Jalla Jalaluhu. The outward is what is the nature of the world Allah has put us in. It is a world of asbab, a world of secondary causes. So you combine between the tawheed, which is seeing things as they truly are, who is really in control, and you have the eye of the sunnah, which is we are in the world of asbab. So we use the asbab, but the heart is not attached to the asbab, the secondary causes. So what that means is taking medicine, saving money, stocking food and supplies, and all of these things do not negate tawakkul in the least. Because you do those things because you're living in the world of aada, the world of aada. What is aada? Aada is just the empirical realities that if I pick up my phone or I pick up my wallet and I drop it, it falls. I can do that 1,000,000 times, and each time it's going to fall down. If I have a stick, and a staff or a stick, and I drop it, it's going to fall down. And then I pick it back up, and then I drop it, and it falls down. And it's going to stay like that. Does it have to be that way, though? Does it have to be that way? Is it always the case that if you drop a stick, that it just lands on the ground and stays as a stick? Is there any other staff or any other stick that has been dropped in the past that didn't remain as a stick? The staff of Musa alayhi salam. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told him to cast down the staff, He told him to throw it down, and then He said, سَنُعِيدُهَا سِيرَتَهَا الْأُولَى. We shall revert it back to its previous seerah. You know, seerah is not just biography. Seerah here means its previous norm. So we live in a world of norms. And operating in the world of norms, we use the asbab. It's a great rahmah that you can predict things. that when I pour this water into the cup, it's going to stay water in a cup. That when I do this, this is going to happen. It doesn't have to be that way. Allah creates the effect in conjunction with the cause, not with the cause as a tool, but in conjunction. This is basic aqeedah. So Allah Ta'ala is the one who creates the conjunction between the causes and the effects. And if He does not will, the causes will not lead to the effects. So this is the basic aqeedah we have as Muslims. So in so many ayat in the Quran, we see Allah Ta'ala is ordering us as believers to put our trust in Him. And in most of these verses, if not all of them, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala is employing a linguistic style that we call taqdeem and ta'khir, where you put one thing forward that is normally at the end. So a basic sentence in Arabic, daraba zaydun amra, you have the subject, the doer, before the object, the one who receives the action. Zayd struck Amr. But you could say it in the other way by reversing. That's why Allah Ta'ala says in many ayat, وَعَلَى اللَّهِ فَلْيَتَوَكَّلُوا. Upon Allah, let them put their trust. So you have tawakkal, فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ, and then you have وَعَلَى اللَّهِ فَتَوَكَّلْ. So that taqdeem and ta'khir indicates hasr, it indicates restriction, meaning only put your trust in Allah. Only put your trust in Allah, in Him alone, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here Sheikh Muhammad Maulud, in talking about the disease of lacking in this tawakkul, he describes it in the context of a person who is so reliant upon others that they are lacking in tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says this is from the lack of yaqeen, the lack of certainty. And the lack of yaqeen is the sign that a person's faith is weak. The yaqeen that we should have as believers, that la nafi'a wa la darra illa Allah, that there is no one who brings benefit or harm except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In yamsaska Allahu bi durrin fala kashifa lahu illa hu. If Allah ta'ala were to cause harm to descend upon you, there's no one who can remove it except for Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. So after defining this, Sheikh Muhammad Maulud explains when these two things become a disease. The longing or desire for other than Allah that negates tawakkul, or the fear of other than Allah that negates tawakkul. He defines when it becomes a haram disease. He says, ثُمَّ الْحَرَامُ مِنْهُمَا مَا غَلَبَ غَلَبَةَ تَصُدُّ عَمَّا وَجَبَ. What is prohibited from these two, longing other than Allah or having this fear of other than Allah, is that which prevents an obligation from being fulfilled. So here, Sheikh Muhammad Maulud is very precise, and he's very careful to delineate between the disliked forms and the haram forms. He says the haram form is trusting in other than Allah in such a way that it prevents you from complying with the divine command, and later he says doing the haram. So you have the neglect of tawakkul that causes a person to neglect such an obligation, right? This could be a person who has an obligation towards another human being. Maybe they're in debt. Maybe there's some right they owe to other people, but they lack tawakkul in Allah to such an extent that they cannot bring themselves to fulfill that right. They're too worried about losing their money. So instead of trusting in Allah and fulfilling the right, they would prefer to just keep that debt and not fulfill it, because there's so much in this scarcity mindset that they're afraid of even fulfilling the rights of others. This lack of tawakkul could also be a person who delays their prayer past the time. They're out in public and they're too afraid to pray publicly, or even out in the corner somewhere, because they're afraid of what other people are going to say or do. That fear of those people indicates this lack of tawakkul, and that lack of tawakkul is causing them to neglect a wajib. That's a really common example. I think we spoke about it, didn't we? Where a person is in public and they know that the time of prayer is in and it's short, and that they're not going to make it at home in time to pray on time. And still, they wait until they get home and they pray it outside of the time. Well, they're praying Asr at Maghrib time. Why? Because they're out shopping somewhere and they're too afraid to just go into a corner somewhere and pray on time because they're fear of other people. And it's not a legitimate fear. We're not talking about legitimate fear of harm. We're talking about it's really just dhann. They don't want to be seen. They don't want to be singled out or have anyone laugh at them or stare at them. What does this person do? Bending up and down, putting themselves on the ground. So this is a kind of fear of other than Allah Ta'ala that causes them to neglect an obligation. So that is a lack of tawakkul that is haram because it causes them to neglect something that is wajib. So what do you see there? You see two things going on. Number one is the haram of neglecting the salat, letting it go past its time. That itself is a sin. But then there is the sin of the heart, which is that lack of tawakkul, which becomes the cause of the other sin. Because some sins give birth to other sins. They give rise to other sins. So when that person makes tawbah, if they come to their senses and realize this is wrong, they have to make tawbah from two things. Tawbah for neglecting the salat, letting it go past its time, and tawbah from having this lack of tawakkul. And in order to do that tawbah, they have to realize that's going on. So at the root of this, he says, is one thing: the lack of yaqeen, the lack of certainty regarding who is really in control, who is the one who can bring benefit and harm ultimately. This leads people, he says, to basically having an unhealthy level of fear of others. So fear of creation is blameworthy when it prevents us from carrying out an obligation or when it causes us to do something haram just out of fear of other people. And we're not talking about ikrah, we're not talking about compulsion where a person is putting a gun to your head or they're threatening you or your family. That's a different scenario altogether. Allah Ta'ala pardons ikrah in those cases. Now, the ulama say that there is another form. They say that it's blameworthy when you fear people to that extent. It's also blameworthy, they say, when a person is so lacking in tawakkul that they fear what is not fearful adatan, conventionally. So this is a person, for instance, who is afraid of, you could think of anything, any kind of unreasonable phobia. Let's say a person is walking and they see a lamb, a little baby lamb, harmless, and they're afraid of the lamb. Like, what's going on here? There's something going on in the heart. So if they fear something, لا يخاف منه عادة, it's not feared conventionally, that is also a kind of blameworthy fear. Now a person could ask, well, what about fear of cockroaches? Cockroaches, are they going to harm you? I don't know. In Pakistan years ago, there were flying cockroaches in some place I was at, and they would land on your clothes and they could actually bite you. So maybe it's not that you fear that, something that's harmless, you're fearing something that actually could hurt you. There's that instinct to defend yourself, obviously. That's different. Some people are afraid of mice. And that fear, we would say that's adatan, that's a conventional fear. Why? Because there's this instinct to fear things that carry disease or filth, things that are disgusting. So you have that disgust in the self. What about fear of snakes, or lions, or tigers, or bears? This is totally normal because Allah Ta'ala has put within human beings this survival instinct. It's interesting with snakes in particular. It's like the human being has within his very nature this fear of snakes. If you're out in the backyard cleaning and all of a sudden you see a snake, it's like your body automatically jumps backwards 10 feet. You don't even think about it. It's that fast. It's in our nature. So that fear is normal because it's based on ada, conventionally speaking. empirically speaking, these things could harm, of course, by the will of Allah, but there's a pattern with them as being predatory animals or poisonous animals and so on. So, how does this apply in other scenarios? The ulama say, for instance, if you are in a place where, or you're getting near to a place where a pandemic has spread, if it's reached a city and you're on the way to the city, you don't go into the city. And once you're in the city where a pandemic has spread, you're not leaving that city to a place where it hasn't touched. And we have the hadith to this effect in the story of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu and Abu Ubaidah, and the whole story in Al-Quds. Now, you have to take steps to preserve your life. One of the maqasid of Sharia, one of the objectives of sacred law, is preservation of life. Now, that preservation of life does not mean you're obligated to take medicine, though. It just means you take normal steps to protect your life. It's not obligatory to take medicine, according to the absolute majority of the ulama. In fact, those who say that it is obligatory, هذا قول شاذ. It's an anomalous view. The majority of the ulama say that at-tadawi, or taking medicine, is mubah, and a minority say it is mustahab. But none of the ulama say that taking medicine is wajib. In min babi awla, even more so taking things that are not medicines, that are experimental. The point is that you take basic steps to preserve your body, your life, and your wealth, and that is not negating tawakkul at all, because we are in the world of asbab. So he says here, أما إذا جر لترك ندبي فالكره وافزع منهما للرب فإن كلا منهما دواه شعورنا أن لا ولا سواه. As for it, this fear or this hope, this lack of tawakkul, leading to the neglect of what is recommended, this is mustahab or mandub, then it's considered reprehensible. So if the lack of tawakkul causes you to leave something wajib, it's haram. If that lack of tawakkul causes you to do something haram, that lack of tawakkul is haram. If that lack of tawakkul causes you to neglect what is mandub, recommended, then that lack of tawakkul is at a makruh level, not a haram level. So it pairs with the categories. He says it's considered reprehensible. In any case, he says, flee in fear to your Lord from both of them. Flee to your Lord from both of them. فَفِرُّوا إِلَى اللَّهِ. The cure for both is to know that there is none who can bring benefit or harm other than Him alone. This is the theoretical cure. The theoretical cure. An-nadari. It is knowing these things and developing yaqeen. So we have to talk about yaqeen. Yaqeen is the cure for this disease. What is yaqeen? We have the famous statement of Imam Ali radiallahu anhu, who said, لو كشف الغطاء ما ازددت يقينا. If the veil were lifted, I would not be increased in certainty one bit. What veil is he talking about? He's talking about the veil between human beings, us, and the unseen world. Like right now, we are in Baytun min Buyutillah. There are malaika. This is a gathering of dhikr and mudhakara and mudarasa. Angels are present. We don't see them. Are there jinn here? Most likely there are believing jinn here. And some of the mashayikh, they would teach classes regularly, and sometimes they would show up for class in the masjid and no students showed up. But they would still teach the class, and someone said, well, why did you teach the class? There's no one there. He said, well, there's probably some believing jinn and some malaika, so I'm still taking benefit myself in delivering the dars. So there's this unseen realm of the angels, the jinn, even, of course, heaven and hell and the barzakh. We don't see what is behind that veil of the unseen. And the ulama say it's a great rahmah from Allah Ta'ala that we have that hijab. Imagine right now if that hijab between the alam al-shahada, the visible world, and the alam al-ghayb were lifted. Imagine if all of a sudden now you could see jinn in their actual form. it will be very hard to live life. It will be very hard to maintain your composure seeing those things. So it is a rahmah that we have that veil. Nevertheless, we know that the highest degree of worship is ihsan. أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه فإن لم تكن تراه فإنه يراك. That you worship Allah as though you see Him. So Imam Ali radiallahu anhu, he's not boasting here when he says, if the veil was lifted, it would not increase me in certainty. He's not boasting. He's simply mentioning one of the blessings of Allah Ta'ala given to him. And he's fulfilling the command of Allah Ta'ala in the Quran. وَأَمَّا بِنِعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ فَحَدِّثْ. As for the blessings of your Lord, speak about them. He is saying that if the veil was lifted, it's not going to increase him in ibadah because that's how committed he is. That's how much certainty he has in the unseen. So what is yaqeen? Now linguistically, yaqeen from ya, qaf, and nun, yaqana, this is the state of water, when the water is still and it's unmoving, without ripples. If you see a pond right before Maghrib and it's just perfectly still, there's no stones going inside, it's just still. That's from where we get the word yaqeen. So what this means is yaqeen is not agitation. It's not this harara. They call it bardul yaqeen, the coolness of certainty. So what is yaqeen exactly? Imam Abdullah ibn Alawi al-Haddad rahimahullah, he defines yaqeen by saying that it is a power, a firmness, and stability, rusukh, of iman that is so great, it becomes like a towering mountain which no doubts can shake and no illusions can rock. So this concept of yaqeen is getting beyond theory, beyond the intellectual affirmation of our beliefs, to having them settle in the heart where there is stillness, being cool and calm in one's certainty that Allah is Allah and creation is creation. Allah is real. God is real. Everything else is dependent upon Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how you get past the intellectual affirmation and to the state of yaqeen? The short and quick answer is that you don't get to it with your own efforts, but effort there must be. You don't get to it with your own efforts, but effort there must be. You get to it by asking Allah Ta'ala for yaqeen. Our strength, our determination, our focus, our study, our effort, all of these things are required, but those are the means as well. And you trust upon musabbibul asbab, the one who affects the causes, not the causes themselves. So you must go to Allah Ta'ala and ask for yaqeen. But there must be effort. There must be some effort that we have to bring to bear for developing certainty. And we see this interesting parallel between something that is given to us by Allah's grace and also making an effort to seek it while recognizing that the one who gives it ultimately is Allah. We're not giving it to ourselves. In the hadith of Rabi' ibn Aslam, he goes to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "Salni, ask me of something. Salni, ask me." And he says, "As'aluka murafaqataka fil jannah." I ask for your companionship in paradise. And what does the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam say? That's the gift of Allah Ta'ala. Allah gives that. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Idhan, if that is the case, فَأَعِنِّي عَلَى نَفْسِكَ بِكَثْرَةِ السُّجُودِ." If that is the case, then help me against yourself with lots of sujood, with lots of prostration. So a person takes the steps while relying upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the same thing for yaqeen. Yaqeen is the cure for lacking tawakkul. And to get yaqeen, there is some kasb involved, some acquisition. But that's like acquiring dunya too. You take the steps, but Allah who gives it. So what are some of the steps that we can do? Well, yaqeen is not, it's not overcompensation, right? The one with yaqeen is not the loudest, not the one who shouts the loudest about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The one with yaqeen is the one who is settled. Bardul yaqeen. There's a calmness, there's a coolness to them. If it's a bright sunny day and you go outside and you see the sun, do you need to shout at people that the sun is shining? If someone says, no, the sun's not shining, but you see the sun, it is bright, there's not a cloud in the sky, why would you need to shout that the sun is shining? It's almost like there's an overcompensation. Perhaps you yourself are not sure, and that's why you shout about it, to confirm it for yourself, to build it up in yourself. So yaqeen is stillness. How do we build yaqeen? The ulama mentioned a number of different steps. One, they say, is listening attentively. Listening attentively is one of the means of yaqeen. And by listening attentively, they mean listening with the ears and listening with the heart. What is so interesting about the Quran is that when Allah Ta'ala mentions the blessings of hearing and sight, in every single ayah, Allah Ta'ala mentions which one first? The hearing is mentioned before the sight. Every single time. And this is why the ulama say that the ni'mah, the blessing of hearing, is greater than the blessing of sight. Why is that? There's a number of reasons, but the chief reason is that if you are blind, you can still hear the Quran. You can hear the words of the Prophet ﷺ. But if you are deaf, you don't hear the ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now you can read the Quran visually if you're deaf but not blind, but the blessing of hearing takes precedence over the blessing of sight. So one of the steps of developing yaqeen is listening. How do we listen? Well, we should think about how we listen when we hear an ayah or a hadith. Do our hearts wander when we hear these things? One of the scholars of the Indian subcontinent, he mentioned an advice to students. He said, and he's speaking to students of knowledge, seekers of knowledge who have memorized the Quran, or they're in the process and they're studying the books of the fuqaha and the muhaddithun and so on. He said to them, listen, as a student, when you are reading a text, when you get to a passage where the scholar is quoting an ayah, don't quickly go past that ayah to the next passage. SubhanAllah, this happens. If you read and study a lot, what will happen is the Sheikh is talking about an issue, and he'll mention a verse here and then a verse there, and the person will get to the ayah, and they'll, I know the ayah, so they just skip down to the next part where the scholar is now explaining something. They get to the next verse, they go past that quickly to go to the content of the scholar. He's saying, no, you should read that just as carefully as you read the words of the scholar, even if you know the verse already, right? Imam al-Dhahabi, he talks about this in Sir A'lam al-Nubala. I don't remember who he was talking about in the biography of one of the muhaddithun. This muhaddith, who's an elderly muhaddith, has memorized 100,000 plus hadith. He said, a young person will come to me and mention a hadith to me, and I listen to it attentively as if I'm hearing it for the very first time, even though I heard that hadith and I transmitted that hadith before he was born. Right? This means, in our context, if you know a hadith and a person comes to you and says, hey, there's this hadith, Qara Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he starts to say it. If you know it, you don't tell him, yeah, I know that one. Give me something else. I know that one already. I got that one. No, you listen attentively as if you've heard it for the first time. So one of the ways of developing yaqeen is developing our skill of listening to the ayat of Allah, not just with the ears, but with the heart. And that's the difference between sama' and istima'. You go into the grocery store, and there's this annoying music that is piped in, and you can't escape it. You have to get your groceries. What is the difference between hearing it and listening to it? Well, listening to it is actively listening, like your ear is engaged. Hearing it is just registering that, yeah, there's this sound, there's this annoying music piped in the grocery store. I don't like it, but I have to get my groceries. Listening is active, where a person is listening with the intention of deriving benefit. So if a person hears the ayat, but without that intention, their yaqeen is not developing. But if they're listening attentively, it develops the yaqeen. That's number one. So the first step is developing that attentive listening. The second step for developing yaqeen, which becomes the medicine to get rid of this lack of tawakkul, is tafakkur, this contemplation upon the cosmos. Now, contemplation is a very significant topic, and it has its own definition. But this is a kind of listening as well. But it is a listening where you engage the eyes and you gather meanings in the heart. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, وَكَذَلِكَ نُرِي إِبْرَاهِيمَ مَلَكُوتَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ لِيَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُوقِنِينَ. And thus we had shown Ibrahim the malakut, the created kingdom of the heavens and the earth. Why? لِيَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُوقِنِينَ, so that he becomes one of the people of yaqeen. So gazing and contemplating upon the cosmos is a means to yaqeen. And Allah Ta'ala refers to these things as the ayat. What are the ayat? Al-aya tushiru ila ghayriha. Al-aya hiya al-alama. The ayah means a sign that points to other than itself. It points to other than itself. The ayah tushiru ila 'azamati al-khaliq subhanahu. The ayah is pointing to the greatness and power and majesty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this means that you're not just watching nature documentaries for entertainment value. It means you look at nature and creation as signs pointing to other realities, pointing to other than themselves, pointing to the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A scientist may look at the nature and the cosmos with more intensity than others. But why, by and large, are scientists not with the strongest yaqeen? You would think that a person who is observing nature at that level of intensity would have stronger yaqeen. Why don't they have yaqeen? The reason why they don't have yaqeen, assuming this is a disbelieving atheist kind of scientist, the reason why is because their starting point, when they observe the creation, their starting point is with certain philosophical assumptions about reality. Their belief that what is fundamentally real is only that which can be measured and put under a microscope and quantified. And they believe that this science, what they call science, which is fundamentally about the ada, about what is measurable, can answer things of a metaphysical nature. So their starting point is completely backwards, and that's why they don't have the yaqeen that a believer would have if they're observing the very same science. So we have to make that distinction. Seeing has to be coupled with seeking, where a person sees and derives a lesson. So that is a way of yaqeen. Just seeing the signs is not going to be enough. Just being shown the signs without connecting those signs and seeing what they point to is not going to be enough. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that as well in the Quran when He speaks about Fir'aun. وَلَقَدْ أَرَيْنَاهُ آيَاتِنَا كُلَّهَا فَكَذَّبَ وَأَبَى. We had shown him all of our ayat, our signs, فَكَذَّبَ وَأَبَى. But he denied and he rejected. So the first one is what? Listening, active listening, seeking benefit. Number two is active contemplation on the cosmos and seeing that these are ayat, and ayat by definition point to other than themselves. So they're pointing to the greatness of Allah. The third and the last is the hardest, and that is practicing what we know. It is acting upon what we know. There is a hadith, or it's actually an athar, a narration, which says, "Man amila bi'ilmihi awrathahu Allahu ilma ma lam ya'lam." Whoever acts upon what they know, Allah will bequeath them with knowledge that they did not know before that. So this is an athar, but we find support for it in the sound hadith Qudsi, in which the Prophet ﷺ mentions that Allah Jalla wa Ala says, "My servant does not draw near to me with anything more beloved than what I have made incumbent upon him, obligatory upon him. And he continues to draw near to me with the voluntary acts, hatta uhibba, until I love him. And when I love him, I become his hearing by which he hears, his seeing by which he sees, his hand by which he grasps, and his foot by which he walks." This hadith gives us the recipe for developing yaqeen. So you have three things here. You have, number one, learning, acquiring ilm. Number two, practicing, acting upon that ilm. And when these two are combined, there comes the resultant state where Allah gives you more. So in the Hadith Qudsi, Allah Ta'ala says, "No, my servant does not draw near to me with anything more beloved than what? What I have made obligatory upon him." How would the person know what is obligatory and what is not? Ilm. So there's ilm, and then there's practicing that, and they continue with voluntary works, hatta uhibba, until I love him. And when I love him, I become his hearing by which he hears, his seeing by which he sees, or his sight by which he sees, his hand by which he grasps, his foot by which he walks. That's the hal, that is the resultant state. And then they acquire more knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And with that more knowledge, there comes more practice, acting upon that knowledge. And then from that comes more and more. So you have this cycle. This cycle, we would call it knowing, doing, and becoming. So knowing, learning what you have to learn, and then practicing it, and then the resultant state that you embody. In that state, by that state, Allah bequeaths you with more knowledge, and with that more knowledge, you practice that too. And as you practice that more, Allah bequeaths you with more. So this is the hardest step of yaqeen, which is knowing, doing, and becoming. Actually learning and actually practicing that in such a way that Allah gives you more. So if a person does these things, they will acquire yaqeen. And when they have yaqeen, they will have sukoon, this tranquility towards the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They will have thiqah, they will have confidence in what Allah ta'ala has guaranteed. Think about a young child, a little toddler. If the father has the toddler and the father throws the child in the air, tosses the child into the air, for a moment the child's a little iffy, but then as the child lands back into the father's grasp, there's this joy. So that confidence that the child has in the father, our confidence in Allah has to be far greater than that. وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. So with that, you have another fruit, turning to Allah Ta'ala with longing, with certainty that this is my Mawla, this is my Nasir, this is my Wali, this is my Raziq, this is my Creator, my Provider, and so on. And with those fruits, a person develops their yaqeen. When they have that yaqeen, they are further and further away from relying upon other than Allah, and they come to embody this tawakkul. And all the time, they're not neglecting the asbab, the secondary causes, but they are using the causes, understanding that Allah created them, and Allah creates the effects in conjunction with the cause. Right? The ulama of Aqeedah, they often say, explaining this, that Allah Ta'ala creates the quenching in conjunction with the drinking of water. Allah creates the burning in conjunction with the fire. Is it necessary that fire burns? Does fire have to burn? Does it create burning in itself independent of Allah Ta'ala? No. The ulama of Aqeedah mentioned there's three positions you can take regarding this. Position number one is to say that the fire or anything else, it creates the effect independently of Allah Ta'ala. And if you say that, you're saying that this is a creator besides Allah. Number two, they say, the person may say the fire, no, it doesn't create independently, but Allah has deposited it with an independent power where it acts autonomously. This is considered kind of heretical. It's considered heretical. It's a misguided understanding about the nature of things. And the orthodox belief is that Allah Ta'ala creates the burning in conjunction with the fire. It doesn't have to be that way. Right? What did Allah Ta'ala say to the fire of Ibrahim when he was cast inside of the fire? Kuni bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim. There's even one athar, there's one narration, Allah Ta'ala knows best about its authenticity, but it's mentioned in the works of tafsir, that when Allah Ta'ala addressed the fire, all of the fires in the world were unsure, are they the ones addressed by that command? So all of the fires in the world all at once went cold. So Allah Ta'ala's power is absolute. Nothing is independent of Allah Ta'ala. So going from the materialist belief to the belief that we have as Muslims is one of the ways of developing this tawakkul and yaqeen. May Allah Ta'ala give us that. Ameen. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wa iyaakum. حان وقت